Hi guys, just got a game to share with you that I played against a player rated in the 1000 to 1100 range today, and what we're just going to do is we're going to look at the differences in spotting tactics and reading the game, so that if you're a player rated in that kind of bracket, this should give you some guidance as to what you should be working on in your own chess game. Okay, so let's just start and dive in. We'll make this fairly quick. So I've got the black pieces. My opponent starts with the unusual birds opening with f4. And it's interesting, actually, in my previous game that I looked at, we had, I think, d4, then followed by f4. And the book described that as birds opening as well. It's an unusual opening. It's not particularly sound. So I just reply to this using something that I know is solid. So I'm going to use the reverse London. Okay, so now we have d4, so similar opening to before, and I bring out my bishop to f5. So if you're not familiar with the reverse London, it's just playing the London system, but as black. So you're playing it in like a mirror image, and the only real difference, apart from having that the board is in reverse, that white does have that extra move at the start. Okay, so we have knight to f3, knight to d7 now, so both knights are looking at this square, so I've brought out my knight just in case white's got any ideas of putting his knight on that nice e5 square. And now e3. So this is kind of interesting. So we've got the dark squared bishop's looking a little bit uncomfortable there, staring at his own kind of inverted dark square pawn pyramid. And also this pawn on e3 is kind of backwards now, and we'll keep an eye on that pawn through the game. So I just play e6, shoring up my pawn chain. We have bishop to e2, preparing to castle maybe kingside, and I play knight to f6, very normal move. White castles, now I play h6. I just want to play a prophylactic move, preventing this knight from coming in here to g5. White now pushes c3, also shoring up his pawn chain, and I play my bishop to e7. Obviously these squares are all out for my dark squared bishop, so I want to make that piece as useful as possible. Ideally, with every move in chess, you want to be making your position better. Okay. I mean, one option could have been to put the bishop on d5, but then there's no future on any of these forward squares, so I figured that at least here on e7 it's got the possibility of controlling these squares now down near white's king. Now the knight decides to come in and mess things up. I just ignore that threat for now, because I figure, okay, this knight's made 2 moves already. If it wants to go and swap itself off, it's going to have to make 3 moves, and then if, for example, it captures my knight, queen recaptures, the knight's just going to disappear and take those 3 moves with it. And the knight does indeed swap itself off. Now, compare the two sides now in terms of development. White has castled, okay, so that's worth 2 points of development. They've also got one piece that's kind of developed. This bishop does have pretty good scope over the board right now, so 3 points of development to white, whereas black has 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces out in the board, and black is also ready to castle either side and complete development, and we're on move 9 here. Okay, so white now plays an unusual knight to a3, and from this point, yeah, I've got this option of grabbing the knight, then the b pawn will have to recapture, so white would end up with these doubled isolated a pawns, but I don't really want to do that, because A, it's a bishop and it's in a reasonable position, and also, you know, I might want to castle my king this side and get my both rooks lined up against white's king, and if I do that, I don't really want to give white a semi-open file already to put his rook on and maybe start harassing my king. So I figure if that knight wants to go and lurk on the side of the board where it's going to be no inconvenience to anybody, then be my guest. So now I capture on f4. Obviously the idea is I just want to remove material around that king. I want access to that king, and more importantly, I want to open up the g file if I can. So now we have a kind of a half-hearted prod. I mean, maybe this is the idea of what why the knight went to a3 to support this bishop, but this isn't an attack, really, because I simply have c6. c6, finishing my light squared pyramid. Obviously, when you're playing with the white pieces, then you have a dark squared pyramid in the London. Just very simple. Now the bishop has to retreat. And that bishop really hasn't improved itself from this position where it was at least scanning quite a lot of the board. Yeah, it's looking at the edges of the board, but from here, it's got nothing. So that bishop has simply just made itself worse. Okay, now I bring my rook across to g8, and you should be able to see a pretty standard tactic here, which is bishop h3. Okay, so this pawn is now pinned because I have no g-pawn, so the rook is looking at the king. If I play my bishop to here, pawn can't capture. And there's the threat of, for example, bishop captures, okay, which does not come with check, but then bishop to f3 would create a discovered check on the king and actually win white's queen. So white can't have that. Anyway, so white captures now on f4, and I decide simply to improve my knight. One important thing about this is I want to stop the rook from being able to go to f2, where it can defend g2. Because g2 is my target. And let's say I put my bishop on here, rook there would simply defuse my attack, okay? So now white can't put their rook on f2, puts his queen on e2 instead, and I go in anyway with my bishop, because now I still have, because the queen is very high value, I still have rook takes g2 with a fork on king and queen with check. So white is now pretty much forced to push g3, and they lose the exchange. So things are looking quite good. And really, guys, this is a pattern that you just need to commit to memory. It's a very, very standard attacking motif. Okay, if the pawn moves, you get yourself a rook, no problem. Now I castle long, so I'm preparing to use both of my rooks to come up against this king here. I want to bring my queen into it. I want to bring all of my pieces, if possible, provided that my king is looked after. I want to bring my pieces into the attack. Now we have the odd knight c5. Now, I do have the option here of capturing, but then we've probably got bishop takes. It's supported by the queen here. And I really don't see any need to open things up around my king. So I simply just push a6, because the knight's also looking at that pawn. And the knight now comes into a7. Now, not the move I would have played. And the reason is because the knight has now trapped itself. You need to check before you go deeper into enemy territory whether you can actually get out again. And here, king b8, and the knight has nowhere to go. Simply nowhere to go. So the knight decides to take out a pawn on its way out of the door. B takes the knight, and now we're up in material still further. Queen grabs on a6. Now I propose a trade of queens with queen b7, and we trade queens, right? White really probably shouldn't have done that in this situation, not when you're down material. Okay, now we have b4, and now I feel like white is starting to lose the grip on this game, because that move just undefends this pawn. So I just grab the pawn with my knight. I'm now attacking this bishop, and I'm also threatening the e2 square with a fork on king and bishop. So bishop retreats, and I go in and attack the give check. Now here I've got an option actually. I could trade my knight for this dark squared bishop, but considering that white has 5 pawns on dark squares, I figure I'm probably just better off removing that central pawn, which means I get a pawn for free rather than just making an equal trade. Bishop a4 is played, and now I bring my rook across. So my rook's looking for a way into this game. So I figure that's a good opportunity to move over to the a file. Bishop now retreats, and I just slide my king over. I just want to avoid any ideas of the rook coming here and this pawn pushing down. Also, if I want to capture this pawn with my bishop, I want to avoid the bishop being pinned against the king. Okay, so there, and now we have a 3 is pushed. White is thinking here that he's defending the pawn, but he's not defending the pawn, and the reason is because after bishop takes, the defender of the pawn on b4 is itself pinned, because if that pawn captures, rook takes rook, and that's a totally winning position now. Okay, so we have bishop across, and now I just drop my bishop back to defend my knight, but this also comes with another tactical threat of its own, and one that white missed in this case. Okay, so white should spot this pattern. Oh, the bishop has just moved. Why has it moved there? Well, it's now in line with my king. The only thing that's stopping it giving check is this knight. Can that knight move with a threat? Well, yes, it can. White misses this and simply pushes a pawn, and now knight to b3 comes with discovered check on the king, but I'm also attacking the rook on a1. King moves, I grab the rook, push a pawn, let's grab some space, half-hearted attack, and white again swaps off material. When you're that far down in material, you really don't want to be making equal trades. And some pawns push, and we trade off some stuff. Now this looks like a free pawn, but it's not. When you've got a major piece, a rook or a queen, excuse me, in line with your king, then this bishop has, yes, it's grabbed a pawn, but it's effectively also pinned itself, okay? And one of the dangers is doubled up rooks. Now the bishop has to fall. And the game finishes relatively straightforward. I grab this last pawn, and now the king moves in here, and that is a nice, neat checkmate. Okay, so if you're in the 1000 kind of 1000 to 1100 thereabouts, then review this game. You know, see if you can see what my opponent playing with the white pieces missed in this game, and just try and spot those patterns, try and get those patterns into your memory bank so that you can help to avoid those kinds of mistakes in your own play in future. Okay, so there you go, quick review of some tactics there. Hope it's been useful for you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.